Hey there, it's Dr. Ashley Southard here for a new episode of Way Out Wednesday. I'm coming to you from Scottsdale, Arizona, where I am the site director and clinical therapist at a New Beginning outpatient treatment center, and also the co-founder and program director of the Healthy Way Out Emotional and Binge Eating Weight Loss Program. So this month, I'm super excited to be bringing you a new, fresh topic that I think is really going to help you develop a more satisfying relationship with food and with yourself. And we're going to be looking at the parallels between how you relate to food and how you relate to your emotions. So what do you do with food and how do you think about food is actually going to be very much the same with what you do with your emotions and how you think about your emotions. So we're going to spend this month looking at some different facets of those parallels. And today I want to look at how black and white thinking shows up in both your relationship with food, also your relationship with your feelings. So black and white thinking, you're all familiar with this. It's a very rigid and dichotomous way of categorizing things into one or the other. So things can be classified as good or bad, right or wrong, yes or no, right? So we're taking something and we're putting it into one or the other. And when we're looking at things that are very concrete and simplistic, this can be a helpful way of categorizing. However, when we're looking at something that's a bit more complex, like food and emotions, this simplistic way of thinking and categorizing really doesn't serve us. So how does black and white thinking show up in your relationship with food? Well, if you have any history with dieting and binging, then you probably have a lot of history with black and white thinking when it comes to your food. So foods tend to get categorized as good or bad in this way of thinking. Foods that are considered more healthy and more nutritious go in the good category. Foods that are considered kind of junky or less healthy are going to go into the bad category. And typically, for people who have a history of dieting, the goal with this kind of thinking is I only want to eat the good foods and I want to avoid the bad foods. But the paradox of that, as maybe you have experienced, is the harder you try to avoid the bad foods, the more you want them, okay? As soon as we tell ourselves you can't have that, guess what? We typically want it that much more. So you're white knuckling your way through, just trying to focus on only the good foods, stay away from the bad foods, even though you really want them and you really like them. And then there is a moment of emotional vulnerability, which is usually going to be in the context of feeling tired, feeling overwhelmed or stressed, maybe feeling angry or sad or lonely. And next thing you know, that artificial control that you had to only eat the good foods goes out the window. And now you find yourself flopping over to the other side of the black and white spectrum, which is I'm just going to dive into all the bad foods. To heck with it, I'm just going to do it. And that may be where then a binge or some kind of overeating happens, okay? Once that episode is over, then you start to go back to the other end of the spectrum. I should only be eating good foods. You beat yourself up for having eaten the bad foods. You maybe feel like a bad person, wondering what's wrong with you. And then you recommit to being good and only eating good, healthy foods. This is how black and white thinking will show up in your relationship with food. And you can end up feeling like you're on this teeter-totter where you're either doing really good or you're doing really bad when it comes to your eating, and there isn't much in between. So there's a lot of vacillating between feeling good and feeling bad, okay? So how does this then show up in your relationship with emotions? What is the parallel here? Well, it's really the exact same process. So for a lot of the people that we work with who are struggling with binge eating, what we hear over and over and over again is that they also classify their emotions as good or bad. So emotions that are comfortable, both for themselves but also for the people around them, tend to get put in the good category. So these will be things like happy and joyful and fine. That's the one I hear the most. And then other emotions are going to be put in the bad category. So any emotion that might make the person uncomfortable for feeling those emotions, but also the people around you. If you're feeling those and they don't like it, then maybe that emotion gets put in the bad category. So this might be things like anger or sadness or frustration or resentment or jealousy, okay? They're uncomfortable to feel. You don't like them. The people around you don't like them. So they get put in the bad category. Again, the goal here in this black and white thinking is only feel the good emotions and stay away from the bad emotions. So how does this look like in your life? Well, you try to always be happy. You try to always be fine. But really, on the inside, you're not feeling happy or fine, but you try everything in your power to stay away from that, to not acknowledge that within yourself, and to not express that to others. However, those bad emotions are building and building and building inside of you, and in a moment of emotional vulnerability, when you are tired, when you are overwhelmed or stressed, those emotions come out. And just like you might binge then on food, you may have some type of emotional explosion, if you will. So maybe you experience yourself as having an outburst or having a meltdown or raging. All the emotions come out, and it's kind of like, to hell with it, I'm just going to let them all out, okay? Just like you do with food. So that is how that can happen inside for you. And then the people around you, because they haven't seen this emotional buildup, they've just seen you fine, 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 fine. And then boom, all of a sudden, all these emotions come out that are intense and big and messy and uncomfortable. Then the people around you are going, where the heck is this coming from? You're being too sensitive. You're being dramatic. You're just too emotional, and they don't understand that there has been this slow buildup and intensifying of emotions inside of you. So then they judge you just based on this, explosion of emotion that they're seeing, and then you feel bad about that, and you go back into that judgmental place where you're beating yourself up. Shoot, I lost control. What's wrong with me? Why did I do that? I should have never let that out. I should have just been fine. Okay? So you can start to see the parallels here between what you do with food and what you do with your emotions. Okay? Things get categorized as good or bad. Food and feelings get categorized that way. Your goal is to only focus on the good and stay away from the bad. But the harder you try to only focus on the good, the more the bad starts to build, whether it's cravings for the bad foods or the feelings of the bad emotions. It builds and it builds. And then in a moment of emotional vulnerability, you lose that control and you end up surrendering to the bad foods or the bad feelings, and you binge or you have an emotional explosion. And then you feel bad about that, you beat yourself up, you criticize yourself for losing that control, and you recommit to only focusing on the good, to only eating good, to only feeling the good emotions. Okay, so now we start to see the parallels here between how you relate to food and how you relate to your feelings, okay? So what do we do to get out of this black and white approach that quite frankly just keeps you stuck? Well, we have to mix the black and the white, all right? If you had a can of black paint and a can of white paint in front of you and you were to mix them, what color would you get? Of course, you would get gray. So we want to take a gray thinking approach to food and feelings. So what do I mean by that? Well, gray thinking relative to food is saying that there is no such thing as good food or bad food. All foods are welcome at your table, okay? So we're no longer going to categorize foods as all good or all bad. There's a spectrum of nutritional value. Sure, some foods have more value, some foods have less value, but at the end of the day, every food product has some nutritional value. And there are some foods that you really like, there are some foods that you sort of like, there are some foods that you don't like. And so what we're doing is we're just trying to create lots of colorful combinations of all of these different foods to create different meals for your body, okay? The goal with gray thinking is not to stay away from the bad foods and only eat the good foods. The goal instead is to eat all foods in moderation. Eat all the foods that you like, eat all the foods that your body needs. Do that in moderation and with balance, and you're going to be good to go. Okay. This also takes away the paradoxical effect of the more you try to stay away from the bad, the more you're tempted to eat it. If you're not trying to stay away from quote unquote bad foods, then you don't have these binge urges to white knuckle your way through it and then in a moment of emotional vulnerability give in to those urges. Because if all foods are on the table at all times, then if you're wanting to eat something, by all means, eat it. Eat it with balance, eat it with moderation, but enjoy it. Allow it to be a part of your regular eating so that those cravings, those psychological cravings, don't build up and eventually take over, okay? And if you're not having these buildup of cravings and then, giving in to these cravings, if you will, vis-a-vis these binges, then you're not beating yourself up and you're not caught in this vicious cycle of feeling like you're either a good eater or a bad eater, okay? So gray thinking relative to food is all foods in moderation, and you enjoy each one of your meals, okay? How does this show up in your emotions? Well, it's very much the same thing. We want to take a gray thinking approach to emotions, which means all emotions are welcomed and all emotions are important signals telling you that something important is going on inside of you. So rather than categorizing your emotions as good or bad, you're saying, you know what? I welcome and embrace all of my emotions because they all bring some psychological value to my life, just like all foods bring some nutritional value. So if you are feeling happy, that has psychological value. If you're feeling anger, that has psychological value. And rather than saying one is good and one is bad, we want to embrace both of them as signals. Now, yes, some emotions are more comfortable and more tolerable. Some emotions are less comfortable and less tolerable, just like some foods are more nutritious or less nutritious. But all of them still have a place at the table, okay? And again, if you are not trying to avoid these bad or uncomfortable emotions, then those emotions don't need to build up inside of you and eventually take over in this emotional explosion that leaves you feeling rotten about yourself. So again, this gray approach where you welcome all foods at your table and you welcome all emotions as helpful signals allows you to feel more balanced and more in control, both in control of your eating and your emotions. And isn't that what your dieting self has been in search of all these years? You've been trying to gain a sense of control over your food and maybe even your life. But it's the black and white thinking that actually leaves you feeling out of control, okay? And it's a gray thinking approach that's going to help you feel balanced and grounded and much more in control of your eating and your emoting. All right. So this week, I really want you to pay attention to when you get caught up in that black and white dichotomous thinking versus when you can embrace the gray. And I'm going to tell you, gray feels a little messy. Okay. It's not clean cut like the black and white thinking is. It's not rigid. So it can feel messy sometimes. And some days anger feels okay and other days anger doesn't feel okay. And some days eating a Twinkie feels okay and other days it feels less okay. So gray is messy. And so we have to be willing to kind of tolerate those fluctuations and not look for the rigidity and the simplicity that black and white thinking offers. Because while it feels simple and it feels helpful, black and white thinking is a total setup for later feeling out of control and dysregulated. Okay? All right, so pay attention to your thinking processes this week as you relate to your food and to your feelings. And then next week, we will be back for another conversation about another facet of how the way you relate to food is very much in line with how you relate to your feelings. All right? Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you back here next time. Bye-bye.